The wind cut through the empty streets of Blackwell like a whisper from the past, stirring up dust and the occasional scrap of forgotten history. In a place where time seemed to have slowed down and then stopped altogether, the air hung heavy with the scent of decay and regret. The once thriving coal town, nestled deep within the Appalachian Hills, was now a quiet monument to a forgotten era, a place where echoes of long-gone lives flickered in the wind, fading almost as quickly as they were heard. If you listened closely, it was easy to imagine the sound of a bustling town, the rhythm of industry, and the laughter of men and women who worked tirelessly to build a life they had. But today, Blackwell was silent. No voices filled the streets. No wheels turned on the iron tracks. No children played near the remnants of what had once been a thriving community. The windows of houses stood dark, their frames cracked and weathered, as though they too had grown tired of waiting. It's easy to forget places like Blackwell, and maybe that's exactly what the town wanted, to be forgotten. After all, its story, like so many other forgotten towns built on the back of industry, had been one of too much sacrifice and too little acknowledgement. No monuments were built to honor the men who died here. No annual tributes celebrated their lives. Their stories, those of the miners who poured their sweat and blood into the earth, faded into the shadows like the town itself. Yet, Blackwell's fate would soon be brought back into the light, not through a monument or a statue, but through something far more personal, something that would become a window into the final, fleeting moment of men who had given everything for this town. It began with the discovery of a simple object, a lunch pail. The lunch pail had been buried under layers of debris and dirt for nearly a century, its contents untouched, preserved in a way that defied time and nature. When a group of explorers, moving to the ruins of Blackwell, stumbled upon it, they had no idea of the significance it would hold. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than an ordinary lunch pail, dented, rusty, and worn from years of neglect. But to the people of Blackwell, this small artifact would become a symbol of everything that had been lost and everything that had been left unsaid. For years, the story of the Blackwell mine collapse had been told in fragments, half-remembered whispers passed down from one generation to the next. The details were unclear, shrouded in mystery. What had really happened on that cold December day in 1929? Why had so many miners lost their lives? And why had so few answers ever come to light? Was the explosion in the mine a tragic accident? Or was there something more sinister at play? The town's official history never went into detail. It simply stated that the mine had collapsed, and with it, the lives of 33 miners had been lost. After that, Blackwell had faded into history, and the names of the men who died that day had become nothing more than a list of forgotten statistics. There had been no memorial, no mass funeral to honor their lives. No one had even bothered to ask what happened to the miners in their final moments. The town, along with its ghosts, simply disappeared. But the lunch pail would change all of that. As the explorers carefully removed the pail from the rubble, they began to piece together its story. Inside, they found remnants of a meal, still intact, though time had not been kind. Crumbs of bread, the faintest traces of sandwich, and a few small, dried-up pieces of fruit were all that remained. The food wasn't much, just enough to sustain a body through the hours of hard labor that miners endured. But it was something. It was proof that the miners had eaten, that they had paused their work, if only for a few moments, to nourish themselves before returning to the depth below. It was a simple act, one that every person on Earth is familiar with, eating a meal to sustain life. But in this case, it was the last meal of the men who had worked in the bowels of the earth, and it had been left untouched, forgotten, until it was unearthed by chance. Why hadn't the men finished their meal? The question lingered in the air like smoke from a long-dead fire. Surely they would have finished it, given the choice. But the explosion had taken that choice from them, and they had been forced to abandon their lunch pails, their tools, their lives, in a desperate rush to escape the violent destruction of their world. Time had claimed so much, their families, their homes, their futures, but the lunch pail was one of the few remnants left behind to tell their story. The lunch pail, though simple, was the thread that would unravel the mystery of that day. But its discovery was only the beginning. For within it, hidden beneath layers of forgotten history, lay an emotional truth that would send shockwaves through the families of the miners, through the town of Blackwell, and through the very fabric of community that had been shattered so long ago. It was easy to imagine that in those final moments, the men of Blackwell didn't know that their lives would soon be over. That moment when the earth trembled and the air filled with the ominous rumble of an impending disaster, the men would clung to hope that they could make it out, that they could make it to safety. After all, they had survived countless dangers beneath the earth's surface. Collapsing tunnels, road gas leaks, cave-ins. They were part of the risks they faced every day. But nothing could have prepared them for the violence that was about to unfold. The lunch pail wasn't just a physical object. It was a symbol of all the lost moments, the fleeting and mundane acts that made up a miner's life. The miners had families to return to, homes they had built, and dreams of a better future for their children. But in the blink of an eye, all of that was ripped away. What they had left behind in their lunch pails, small scraps of food and the remnants of their lives, would become the only physical evidence that they had ever existed. The story of Blackwell's collapse had been clouded in mystery for decades, as rumors and theories swirled about the cause of the explosion. Some claimed it was a gas explosion. Others said it was a failure of the mine support system, while a few suggested that sabotage may have been involved. But in the absence of clear answers, the true story had become just another casualty of time, buried beneath the debris of the mine and the silence of those who survived. What had happened to the men of Blackwell? Why had so many perished? And why had their deaths been left unanswered for so long? And why, in the midst of this tragedy, had the town's voice been silenced? These questions would soon be answered, but not in the way anyone had expected. The discovery of the lunch pail would lead to a journey, one that would reveal more than just the truth about that fateful day. It would uncover the profound emotional toll of loss and the psychological cost of silence. The people of Blackwell had been left with nothing but unanswered questions for too long, and now they would have to confront the truth. As the camera lingered on the lunch pail, its battered surface now a symbol of resilience and loss, it became clear that this seemingly insignificant object will hold the key to unlocking the story of the miner's final moments. The town, once forgotten, would rise from the ashes of its own history, and the voices of the men who died in the mine would finally be heard. In their final moments, they had left behind a small trace of their lives, a simple lunch pail, a meal left unfinished, and a story that would finally be told. The wind picked up again, swirling around the remnants of Blackwell, carrying with it the whispers of the past. It was a reminder that even in the silence, even in the places that time had abandoned, there were stories waiting to be unearthed. And sometimes those stories were more than just history. They were a part of who we were and who we had been. On the cold morning of December 12th, 1929, Blackwell, a quiet coal town tucked into the Appalachian Hills, was alive with the hum of routine. The miners, some seasoned veterans of the earth's most dangerous depths, others young and new to the unforgiving labor, prepared for another day underground. As they lined up outside the mine's entrance, their faces hidden beneath layers of dirt, sweat, and the early morning mist, there was no sense that the day would be anything but ordinary. They'd all been through this before. The long hours, the dark tunnels, the constant threat of cave-ins and gas explosions. For these men, the mine was a world they knew all too well, a place both familiar and dangerous. But on this day, the earth itself was about to betray them, and the lives of these miners would be forever altered in a matter of minutes. The mine itself was vast, an intricate network of tunnels and shafts that stretched deep beneath the hills, each one leading to layers of coal that had been the backbone of Blackwell's existence. The town had been built around the mine. It was its lifeblood, its reason for being. The men who worked in those tunnels were the town's foundation, its heartbeat. But the earth, which had given so much to the people of Blackwell, was also a capricious and dangerous master. Gas pockets had been known to form, ready to ignite at the slightest provocation. The tunnels, once meticulously carved, had begun to show signs of age and decay, and some of the older miners had spoken in hushed tones of an impending disaster. Yet, as always, they pushed those thoughts aside. Fear was a luxury no miner could afford, especially when their families depended on them to bring home the paycheck each week. So, they descended into the depth of the earth, one after the other, their faces grim but determined. The morning passed like any other. There were no unusual tremors or sounds, nothing that would indicate the violence that was about to unfold. The miners worked in the familiar rhythm of their labor, striking picks against coal, the sound echoing off the walls of the mine, the air thick with the dust of their work. Above ground, the town continued to sleep, unaware that within hours, everything would change. The men worked, but there was an unspoken tension in the air, a feeling that something was wrong, a subtle unease that prickled at the back of their minds, though none of them spoke of it. Then, just before noon, the earth began to shake. It started slowly, an almost imperceptible tremor that at first seemed like nothing more than the usual rumblings of a mine in operation. But then it grew stronger, more forceful, as though the earth itself was shifting, stirring from some long-forgotten slumber. The walls of the tunnel groaned under the strain, and a low, ominous roar reverberated through the ground. Men stopped working, instinctively looking toward each other with wide eyes. There was no doubt now. Something was terribly wrong. In the blink of an eye, the mine that had once been their livelihood became a tomb. The sound of shifting rocks and breaking beams filled the air as the earth swallowed them whole. The force of the explosion was so violent, so sudden, that the miners had no time to react, no time to escape. The very ground beneath them seemed to collapse inward, as if it had turned against them. The explosion sent a shockwave through the tunnels, and the mine was plunged into chaos. The sound of cracking stone and splintering would drown out everything else. Men were knocked off their feet, some crushed by falling debris, others disoriented by the blast. Dust and smoke filled the air, choking them as they struggled to breathe. The heat from the explosion scorched the walls, and the smell of burning wood and coal mingled with the suffocating stench of fear. For those who survived the initial blast, it was a race against time. The air, already thick with dust, grew hotter and more toxic as the minutes stretched on. The men were trapped, the shafts leading to the surface now blocked by fallen rocks and collapsed beams. Panic set in. They shouted for help, but there was no one to hear them. They were alone, buried deep within the earth, cut off from the world above. In those moments, the miners fought for survival. Some of them tried to climb over the debris, desperate to find a way out. Others huddled together, their faces pale with fear, praying for a miracle that would never come. But for all their strength, all their will to survive, there was nothing they could do. The mine had turned into a death trap, and the clock was ticking. The ground above them had already been cracked open, and any hope of rescue seemed impossible. The few survivors who were able to dig through the rubble could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on them, suffocating them, while above ground, the world went on, unaware of the horrors unfolding below. Minutes turned to hours, and the situation grew more dire. The men began to realize the full extent of the disaster. They were trapped underground, with no way of knowing if anyone even knew they were alive, if anyone was coming for them. And yet, there was a strange calm in their final moments, a silence that was almost more suffocating than the dust that filled the air. Their minds, clouded by fear, began to drift. Some of them thought of their families, wives and children who depended on them, who would never know what had happened. Others thought of their fellow miners, of the camaraderie they had shared, the unspoken bond that had held them together through the hardest days. But for all of them, there was no escaping reality. They were trapped, and their chances of survival were slim. Meanwhile, above ground, the town of Blackwell remained blissfully unaware of the catastrophe unfolding below. It wasn't until the first tremors of the explosion reached the surface that the townspeople began to take notice. By then, it was too late. The mine had already collapsed, and the miners were already lost. The town's few surviving souls, family members, friends, and co-workers, stood helpless at the entrance to the mine, staring into the yawning darkness that had swallowed their loved ones. There was nothing they could do. The explosions had sealed the mine's entrance, and rescue attempts would have to wait. Time was not on their side. But as the hours wore on and no word came from the miners, the first sparks of panic began to flicker in Blackwell's heart. The realization slowly crept in. Something terrible had happened, and the town might never be the same again. The people of Blackwell could feel it in their bones, the collective weight of the tragedy that had unfolded beneath their feet. The men they had known, worked with, and loved were gone. They had been swallowed by the earth, and no one knew why. The uncertainty hung in the air, suffocating everyone it touched. As the sun set on that cold December day, the town of Blackwell was in mourning, though they hadn't yet grasped the full scope of the disaster. All they knew was that the earth had betrayed them, taking their loved ones in an instant. The days that followed were filled with grief, confusion, and a desperate search for answers. But there were none to be found. The collapse had been so sudden, so violent, that no one knew what had truly happened to men who had died there. Was it just an accident? Or was there something more to the story, something hidden deep within the earth, buried with the miners? The mystery of Blackwell's mine collapse would never truly be solved. As the days turned into weeks, the town would begin to rebuild, but the scars of that disaster would remain. The faces of the miners who perished would live on in the memories of their families, and the stories of their final moments, lost, forgotten, and overshadowed by the tragedy, would fade into obscurity. But one day, a simple lunch pail, buried under the rubble of Blackwell's past, would rise from the dust, carrying with it the key to unlocking the story of what happened that day. It was a small piece of the puzzle, but it would prove to be enough to bring the town's darkest secrets into the light. And in doing so, it would forever change the way the people of Blackwell remembered their lost loved ones. The discovery of the lunch pail in the rubble of Blackwell's collapsed mine seemed almost surreal, as though the past itself had reached out from the depths to offer a single, fragile clue. Buried beneath tons of rock and debris for decades, the object emerged from the earth like an artifact, an unwilling messenger from a time long gone. When the group of explorers stumbled upon it, none of them knew the profound significance it would hold. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a forgotten relic, one more remnant of a town that had been swallowed by both history and nature. The pail was battered and rusted, a victim of the years it had spent trapped under the crushing weight of the mine's collapse. Its metal surface was worn, the once vibrant colors of the tin dulled by layers of dirt and corrosion. There were no markings to suggest whose lunch pail it had once been, no identifying name or number, just the faintest outlines of what could have been initials scratched into the side. Yet, despite its outward appearance of being an ordinary object, an object lost to time, it felt like more than that. The pail had survived something that should have destroyed it completely. It had endured the violence of the explosion, the years of burial beneath tons of rock, the crushing pressure of time and earth. And now, it was the one thing that could connect the world above to the world below, the bridge between those who had lived and those who had died. As the explorers carefully wiped away the dirt, revealing more of the pail's weathered surface, something extraordinary became clear. Inside, buried beneath the layers of grime and age, was a small half-eaten meal, a simple lunch, prepared for a miner, perhaps to sustain him through another long day in the darkness of the tunnel. The food was not much. A piece of bread, some dried-up fruit, and what looked like the remnants of a sandwich. The meal, preserved in a way that defied the odds, was an eerie and poignant reminder of the man who had packed it. What was left in the pail spoke volumes about the miner's final moments. Here, nestled in the crumpled tin, was the evidence that, for just a few moments, the miner had paused in the midst of his grueling work to eat, to take a break and refuel for the long hours ahead. It wasn't much, just a simple, humble meal, but in its simplicity, it held an emotional weight that went beyond the object itself. The remnants of the food were a silent witness to the life the miner had been leading when everything had changed. Had he finished the meal, or had the explosion torn him away in the middle of his break, before he had a chance to take another bite? The thought haunted those who studied the pail. They couldn't help but wonder, did he know it would be his last meal, or had he believed, like so many others, that he would finish it, return to work, and survive another day underground? It was this mystery that the lunch pail would ignite, a mystery that lay at the heart of what had happened in the depths of Blackwell's mind that fateful December day. The more people looked at the lunch pail, the more they began to speculate about the fate of the miner who had packed it. Who had he been? What had he been like? Was he a man who had worked in the mine for years, someone used to the dangers and rhythms of the underground? Or was he a newcomer, someone who had only recently entered the bowels of the earth, hoping to make a living in a place that offered few other options? The more they thought about it, the more questions arose. But despite all the curiosity, the answers remained elusive. The lunch pail offered no answers. It only deepened the mystery. The food inside seemed to suggest something important. But what? Had the miner been in the middle of a normal day when the disaster struck? Or had he known something was coming, something they couldn't yet comprehend? To those who had never worked in a mine, it was easy to imagine that a miner's final moments would be chaotic, filled with panic and fear. But the truth was far more complicated. The work in the mines was brutal, unrelenting, but it was also a part of everyday life for these men. Many had worked the mine for years, surviving hazards, working through the knowledge that at any moment, disaster could strike. There was no glamour to this life, no romanticism. For the miners, the earth was both their sustenance and their enemy, a constant force that had to be reckoned with. They had come to expect danger, to live with it as a daily companion. But none of them could have anticipated the violence that would come when the mine collapsed. The explosion was quick, brutal, and unexpected. For the miners trapped below, it was a nightmare they couldn't prepare for. As the lunch pail was carefully studied, experts began to theorize about the significance of what they had found. The food that had been left behind seemed almost too untouched, preserved by the very conditions that should have destroyed it. The bread, though stale, had not yet hardened. The fruit, though dried out, was still intact. It was as though the miner had packed it just moments before the disaster struck. But had it been left in haste, would the miner suddenly called away from his meal in the middle of an explosion? Or had it been left behind because the miner knew the end was near? The lack of significant damage to the food suggested it hadn't been left behind in a frantic rush. Rather, it was almost as if the miner had made a conscious decision to leave it behind, either because he knew the explosion was coming or perhaps because he had been unable to finish it before the earth tore the world apart. The lunch pail was more than just a piece of metal with food inside it. It was a symbol of the men who had worked in the mines, men whose names had been lost to time. In that simple tin container, there was a wealth of untold stories, a glimpse into the lives of the miners who had lived and died in the shadows of the earth. It was easy to forget these men, to let them fade into the background of history, their lives reduced to a line in an old record book. But the lunch pail, with its contents still preserved, demanded attention. It forced the question, who had these men been, and what had their lives really been like? How had they lived? What had they left behind? In the face of this discovery, it was impossible to ignore the emotional toll of the disaster. For the families of the miners, the lunch pail represented the loss of something more than just a person. It symbolized the untold stories that had been left unfinished. Their loved ones had been swallowed by the earth, their lives cut short in a tragedy that left no answers. The lunch pail, though small and inconspicuous, became a focal point for all the grief, anger, and sorrow that had been building in the town for years. It was not just a reminder of the disaster. It was a reminder of the absence left behind by those who had been taken too soon. In the years that followed the mine collapse, the town of Blackwell tried to move on. The survivors, those who had lost fathers, brothers, and sons, struggled to rebuild their lives. But the memory of that fateful day lingered, as heavy and inescapable as the dust that had filled the mine. And so, as the lunch pail was passed from hand to hand, examined and re-examined, it became a symbol, a physical reminder of what had happened, of the men who had lived and died beneath the earth. No longer just a lunch pail, it had transformed into something more profound, a bridge between the past and the present, a link between those who had been left behind and the future that could never be the same. The lunch pail had given a voice to the silence of Blackwell's tragedy. It spoke of lives interrupted, of futures lost, of a moment in time that could never be reclaimed. It was the only thing left to carry their story forward, quiet yet insistent. Through it, the miners of Blackwell would finally be remembered. As the years passed, the discovery of the lunch pail ignited a spark in Blackwell. The people of the town, who had long tried to put the pain of the disaster behind them, were faced with a new wave of questions. Those who had lived through the collapse were haunted by the mystery of what had really happened that day. For decades, the official explanation had been simple: a gas explosion, an unforeseen disaster, the kind of tragedy that was all too common in mining communities. But was that the whole story? Was it really just an accident? Or was there something more, something dark and hidden, lurking beneath the surface? The lunch pail, with its simple yet profound mystery, forced the people of Blackwell to confront that question. Why had it been left behind in the mine, untouched by time? Why was the miner's meal still there, so eerily preserved? These questions seemed to demand answers, and as more people looked at the object, they began to realize that the truth might not be as clear-cut as they had once believed. The theories and speculations that arose from the discovery were many and varied, each one more unsettling than the last. Some suggested that the explosion had been a freak accident, the result of a gas pocket that had suddenly ignited. Others, however, began to wonder if it had been a disaster waiting to happen, the culmination of years of neglect and mismanagement. Could the collapse have been prevented? Had the miners been doomed from the start? One of the first theories to emerge was that the mine had suffered a catastrophic gas explosion. Gas pockets were known to form in certain sections of the mine, and in the years before the disaster, there had been warnings from the miners themselves. Some had even refused to go down into the most dangerous areas of the mine, fearing that the conditions were too risky. But despite these warnings, the mine's operators had continued to push the miners to work harder and longer hours, often at the expense of safety. There were stories of corners being cut, of maintenance schedules being ignored, of warnings being dismissed in the name of profit. The people of Blackwell had always known that mining was a dangerous business, but had they underestimated just how dangerous it could be? The idea that the collapse had been caused by a gas explosion seemed plausible, even likely. It was a tragic but understandable accident, a deadly chain of events set in motion by a single, seemingly insignificant factor. But as more people began to look into the history of the mine, doubts started to surface. Could it really have been just a gas explosion? Was that all there was to it? The more the town's historians and mining experts dug into the past, the more they began to uncover a web of unanswered questions, a tangle of secrecy and negligence that raised more concerns than it resolved. The lunch pail, with its silent, haunting presence, was like a puzzle piece that didn't fit the official narrative. It was too perfect in its simplicity. It was as if it had been left behind on purpose, as though the miner had known that the end was near and had chosen to abandon his meal, to leave everything behind in the face of something far worse than a mere explosion. A second, more unsettling theory began to take hold as more people considered the possibility that the collapse had been a result of something far more deliberate, a failure in the mine's infrastructure, the result of years of neglect, perhaps even a deliberate cover-up. The idea that the mine's owners and operators had been aware of the risks but had ignored them for financial gain began to circulate, whispered from one person to the next. Stories started to emerge about corners being cut, about repairs that had been postponed, about dangerous working conditions that had been tolerated in the name of profit. Some began to wonder if the explosion had been a tragedy waiting to happen, a disaster caused by systemic failures that could have been avoided. Had the miners been sacrificed for the sake of maintaining production, for the sake of keeping the town's economic engine running? Had their lives been considered expendable? This theory was difficult to dismiss. The more people dug into the town's history, the more evidence they found of negligence on the part of the mine's operators. Reports of cracks in the mine support beams, of unstable tunnels that had been left untouched for years, began to surface. Some of the miners had even raised concerns before the explosion, but their warnings had gone ignored. The official reports in the Times suggested that the collapse had been a freak accident, an unforeseen event that no one could have predicted. But as the town began to dig deeper, it became clear that the disaster had not been as unpredictable as everyone had been led to believe. It was a failure of safety, a failure of oversight, and a failure of responsibility. But there was something more, something even darker that began to emerge as the town continued to investigate. A third theory, more sinister than the others, began to take root in the minds of some of Blackwell's more skeptical residents. What if the explosion had not been an accident at all? What if the mine had been sabotaged? The idea was a chilling one, but it was not without merit. Blackwell, like many coal towns, had long been a place of tension between the miners and the mine's operators. Labor disputes, strikes, and protests had been a common occurrence throughout the region, and the miners had often fought for better wages, better working conditions, and more rights on the job. Could it be that someone, perhaps a disgruntled worker or a rival faction, had deliberately set the explosion in motion, seeking revenge for the years of mistreatment? The idea of sabotage was difficult to prove, but it was a theory that was impossible to ignore. The miners had been living on the edge, and someone had pushed them over. Despite the chilling nature of these theories, none of them could definitively explain what happened in the mine that day. The evidence was scattered, incomplete, and often contradictory. Some of the miners' families were convinced that the disaster had been the result of corporate greed and negligence, while others held on to belief that it had been an unfortunate accident, a tragic but unavoidable event. The lunch pail, with its half-eaten meal and its quiet, haunting presence, seemed to ask more questions than it answered. It was a symbol of everything that had been lost, the lives, the hopes, the dreams, and everything that remained unknown. The more the people of Blackwell searched for answers, the more elusive the truth became. The mine's records had been destroyed in the collapse, and the few surviving documents offered little in the way of concrete information. The official investigations into the disaster were inconclusive, and the families of the miners were left with nothing but questions and speculation. The lunch pail, in a way, became a symbol of that uncertainty, a reminder that the truth was not always as simple as it seemed. It was a reminder that sometimes the answers we seek are hidden beneath layers of history, of bureaucracy, of silence. As the years passed, the theories about what happened in Blackwell's mine continued to evolve. Each new revelation seemed to raise more questions, and with each unanswered question came a deepening sense of unease. The town had been forever changed by the disaster, and the people who had lived through it would never forget the men who had perished in the mine. They had left behind a mystery that could never be fully understood, a mystery that had been buried beneath the earth for far too long. And yet, in the midst of all the uncertainty, one thing remained clear. The men who had died in the mine were more than just victims of a disaster. They were human beings with lives and stories of their own, and their memory deserved to be honored, even if the truth about what happened would never fully be known. The lunch pail, with its remnants of food and its silent witness to the past, became a way for the town of Blackwell to remember them. And as the mystery of the explosion continued to unfold, it was a memory of those men, their lives, and their loss that would forever remain at the heart of the town story. The mystery surrounding the Blackwell mine collapse deepened with every passing year, each new revelation adding layers to the unanswered questions that had haunted the town for decades. The lunch pail, once a seemingly insignificant object buried beneath tons of rubble, had become the focal point of the town's growing obsession with the truth. In the quiet corners of Blackwell, whispered conversations began to turn into fervent discussions, debates that stretched late into the night. Was it a simple tragedy, or had something more sinister transpired that day in 1929? The lunch pail, with its half-eaten meal and weathered surface, had captured the imagination of the town and had become a symbol of the past that could no longer be ignored. At the center of it all stood the families of the miners who had perished in the collapse. For years, they had been left with nothing but a hollow sense of loss, their loved ones claimed by an explosion whose cause remained unclear. They had been forced to live with the idea that their husbands, sons, fathers, and brothers were just another statistic in the long, tragic history of mining disasters. The official narrative had been simple. A gas explosion had triggered the collapse, claiming the lives of 33 miners. There had been no grand investigations, no official memorials, and no widespread public outcry. The people of Blackwell, like so many other mining towns, had accepted the tragedy as part of the price of industry, of progress. But the lunch pail challenged that narrative, pulling the past out of the shadows and into the harsh light of scrutiny. As the years wore on, the families of the miners began to search for answers, not just for themselves, but for the men who had died in the mine. They refused to accept the simplistic explanation they had been given. They could no longer stand by and let their loved ones be reduced to a faceless casualty of an industrial accident. They wanted to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The lunch pail, which reminder of the miners' last moments, became a powerful symbol of that search. It was not just an artifact from the past. It was a piece of their history, their grief, and their unresolved questions. The families reached out to historians, to experts in mining safety, to anyone who might help them uncover the truth. They demanded a full investigation into the events that had led up to the explosion. They were tired of the secrecy, the silence, and the unanswered questions. The lunch pail had become their rallying cry, a symbol of their refusal to let the story of their loved ones fade into obscurity. What had really happened that day in 1929? Why had the mine collapsed? Was it just an accident? Or had there been something more at play, something that had been hidden for all these years? As the investigation into the collapse gained momentum, new theories began to emerge. It became clear that the disaster had not been as simple as everyone had once believed. The mine, it seemed, had been plagued by problems long before the explosion occurred. The tunnels were unstable, the ventilation systems inadequate, and equipment outdated. The miners had been working under dangerous conditions with little regard for their safety. It was now apparent that the disaster had been a long time coming. The lunch pail, which had once seemed like a small and insignificant object, had become a symbol of the miners' struggle, of their lives and deaths in an environment that had failed them. Some experts pointed to the buildup of methane gas, which was known to be highly explosive in coal mines, as the cause of the blast. Methane was a constant threat to miners, and it could accumulate in pockets within the mine if proper ventilation was not maintained. If a spark had ignited the gas, it would have triggered a violent explosion, leveling the mine and trapping the miners inside. But was it just a gas explosion, or had there been something more? The families of the miners refused to believe that their loved ones had simply been victims of an accident. They wanted answers, and they were determined to find them. As the investigation continued, some miners who had survived the disaster began to come forward with their own accounts of the events leading up to the collapse. Their testimonies painted a picture of a mine that had been in disrepair for years, with safety protocols often ignored and conditions growing worse with each passing day. One miner, who had narrowly escaped the explosion, described how the foreman had insisted on pushing the men to work harder, even when they had raised concerns about the integrity of the tunnels. Another survivor recalled hearing strange noises deep within the mine, sounds that suggested the air pockets were dangerously unstable. Yet, despite these warnings, the work had continued. The production quotas had remained high, and the mine had been pushed to its limits. But the more the survivors spoke, the more it became clear that there were other forces at play. Some of the miners believed that the explosion had been no accident, but the result of deliberate actions taken by those in charge of the mine. There had been rumors of sabotage, whispers that someone with a grudge had deliberately set the explosion in motion. The idea seemed absurd at first. Why would anyone intentionally destroy the mine and kill so many people? But the more they looked into the history of the mine, the more plausible it became. Blackwell, like many mining towns, had been a place of deep division. There were constant tensions between the workers and the owners, between the men who labored in the dark and the men who profited from their sweat. Strikes, labor unrest, and violence had marked the town's history. The miners had fought for better wages, better working conditions, and more rights on the job, but the mine owners had always been resistant to change. Was it possible that someone, perhaps a disgruntled worker or a rival faction, had deliberately sabotaged the mine to force the owners to take notice? Could the explosion have been an act of retaliation, an extreme measure taken by someone who felt their voice had been silenced for too long? The possibility of sabotage was chilling, and yet was not entirely without merit. The labor struggles in Blackwell had been fierce, and there were long-standing grievances between the workers and the management. The miners had often complained about the dangerous working conditions, the lack of safety measures, and the way they were treated by the owners. In the weeks leading up to collapse, there had been rumors of growing unrest, of men becoming disillusioned with the promises of the mine's operators. Had someone finally taken matters into their own hands? The families of the miners, already devastated by the loss of their loved ones, were now faced with an even more painful reality: the possibility that their deaths had been the result of human malice, not just a tragic accident. If the explosion had been caused by sabotage, it meant that someone had intentionally set the wheels of disaster in motion, that someone had chosen to put profit and power above the lives of the workers. The idea was too monstrous to fully comprehend, and yet the more the investigation uncovered, the more it seemed like a possibility that could not be ignored. The lunch pail, now viewed with new eyes, became more than just a symbol of the miners' last moments. It became a symbol of the larger forces at play in the story of Blackwell. The pail, with its remnants of bread and fruit, was a window into the lives of the miners, men who had been caught in the crossfire of a system that valued productivity over safety, profit over people. The town of Blackwell, which had once been a place of pride for its hard-working citizens, had become a microcosm of the broader struggles taking place across the nation. The lunch pail represented the loss of innocence, the moment when the miners' daily lives were ripped away by an explosion that shattered everything they had known. As the investigation into mines' collapse continued, the people of Blackwell were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. The truth about the mine's safety, about the negligence that had led to the explosion, and about the possibility that someone had deliberately caused a disaster would eventually come to light. But in the end, it wasn't just about the cause of the explosion. It was about the lives that had been lost, the families that had been torn apart, and the town that had been forever changed. The lunch pail, with its simple but poignant message, had brought these stories to the surface. It had forced the town to confront the past in a way that was both painful and necessary. The people of Blackwell, once resigned to the idea that their tragedy was just another forgotten page in history, now found themselves at the center of a story that demanded to be told. The lunch pail had given the town a voice, a way to remember the men who had been lost and to honor their legacy. But it had also opened old wounds, bringing up the raw emotions of grief, anger, and betrayal. The truth, when it finally came, would be just as complicated as the history of the town itself. And yet, in the end, it was the memory of those men, their lives, their struggles, and their untold stories that would be the legacy of Blackwell. The lunch pail had brought them back into the light, and in doing so, it had given them a place in history that they would never again be denied. The mystery of the Blackwell mine collapse seemed to spiral deeper with each passing revelation, as the investigation began to uncover layers of history, deceit, and overlooked dangers that had shaped the fate of the miners who perished that fateful day in 1929. The lunch pail, now a tangible piece of the past, had begun to serve as the bridge between those lost lives and the town's current struggle for closure. But it was clear, the search for answers was no longer simply about understanding what had caused the explosion. It had become an exploration of the systems, the society, and the individuals whose choices, both large and small, had led to this tragedy. While the families of the miners pushed for greater scrutiny into the events surrounding the collapse, Blackwell's mining history began to surface with chilling clarity. The town had been built on the shoulders of these men, yet it was also founded on exploitation and inequality, on a ruthless drive to extract as much as possible from the earth and its people. The mine, once a lifeline for families, had become a symbol of this unyielding pursuit of profit, an institution that was indifferent to the dangers imposed on the workers it relied on. The more people looked into the past, the more they saw a pattern of negligence and disregard for life. Patterns that stretched back years, even decades, before the explosion. The deeper the investigation went, the more unsettling the discoveries became. The Blackwell Coal Company had been, for many, the very heart of the town's economy. People came from all over to work in the mines, seeking better opportunities, lured by the promise of steady wages in a town where jobs were scarce. But behind the promise of prosperity lay a darker reality. The working conditions were brutal, and safety regulations were either insufficient or completely ignored. The miners, who spent their days in the depth of the earth, had little choice but to work in these conditions. Their livelihood was tethered to mine. Their families depended on the wages earned from laboring in the most dangerous and unforgiving environment imaginable. But even though the miners knew the risks, the management of the mine, largely made up of people who lived far removed from the dangers of the underground, was indifferent to the realities of their daily struggles. Profit, not safety, was the driving force behind decisions, and in the face of rising production demands, corners were cut, maintenance was deferred, and the safety of the workers was placed on the back burner. One of the most striking elements that began to emerge was the disregard for the infrastructure of the mine. The shafts and tunnels that the miners had relied on had been aging, neglected in ways that left them vulnerable to collapse. Despite warning signs from workers, whose concerns about the safety of the tunnels and ventilation systems were consistently dismissed, the mine operators kept pushing forward. They knew the risks, but they chose to ignore them, prioritizing output over the lives of those who risked everything beneath the Earth's surface. It was this complacency, this arrogant indifference to the real dangers, that seemed to have contributed most to the collapse. There were reports that a significant portion of the tunnels had been weakened by years of heavy mining, and despite the growing evidence that the mine's structural integrity was compromised, no meaningful action was taken to reinforce them. The miners, for their part, were aware of the risks they faced every day. They could hear the faint creaks and groans of the rock above them, feel the subtle tremors that indicated the earth was shifting. But they were powerless to do anything about it. They were workers, not engineers, and their role was to dig, to break apart the earth, to extract the coal that fueled the local economy. In the eyes of the mine's owners, they were little more than cogs in the machinery of industry, replaceable and expendable. To raise a protest or refuse to work would have meant losing their jobs, and with that, the means to support their families. Then there were the conditions in the mine's air, another factor that added to the miners' growing unease. Methane gas, a silent and invisible killer, was a constant danger in coal mines, and Blackwell was no exception. The gas was highly explosive, and if it accumulated in pockets within the mine, a single spark could ignite it, leading to a catastrophic explosion. The ventilation systems in the mine were rudimentary at best, often clogged with coal dust and at worst, completely ineffective. Miners knew that breathing in the air for too long could cause damage to their lungs, leading to diseases such as black lung, which was a common affliction in mining communities. But the risk of gas explosions was the greatest threat. It was something the miners were always aware of, always on edge about. Yet, in Blackwell, as in many other towns, the issue of safety, whether it was adequate ventilation or structural integrity, was never given the attention it deserved. What made the situation even more dire was a growing tension between the mine's management and the miners themselves. Labor unrest had been simmering for years, with the miners demanding better wages, improved working conditions, and most crucially, the right to have a say in their own safety. The company had fought back fiercely, resisting any efforts to unionize and maintain control over the workforce. Strikes had been common, though rarely successful, as the mine owners held most of the power. In a place like Blackwell, where every family was tied to the success of the mine, the idea of going on strike was almost unthinkable. Yet, many miners had been on the brink of demanding real change. The tension had been palpable in the months leading up to the explosion. And then there was the weathering of human resilience, the constant threat of disaster, the pressure to meet deadlines, the fear of being replaced. It all weighed on the miners. They worked through sickness, fatigue, and injury. There was no choice but to push forward. Every day, the work seemed to grow harder, and every hour, the mine felt less stable. Those who worked in the mine for years had grown used to the sounds of the earth shifting and the occasional rockfall, but they also knew that every minor tremor could be the start of something much worse. They lived in a constant state of alertness, but that alertness had begun to fade over time, drowned out by the overwhelming need to keep the mine running and the wages coming in. It was an existence marked by an unspoken understanding that the workers were expendable. The families of the miners, meanwhile, had been suffering in silence. The wives, the children, the mothers who stayed behind while their loved ones went down into the darkness, all knew the price of the work, even if they couldn't always understand it. They saw the toll it took on their husbands and fathers, heard the coughing, saw the exhaustion in their eyes, but had little choice but to accept it. The town of Blackwell, which had once been a thriving community, had become increasingly divided. On one side, there were the mine owners, distant and unaccountable, and on the other, the miners whose lives were spent toiling in the deep, dark tunnels below. The miners didn't just work for themselves. They worked for the survival of their families and their communities. The mine was their only source of income, and without it, there was no livelihood. As the investigation into the collapse unfolded, the unsettling reality of the mine's operation became clearer and clearer. The explosion that had claimed the lives of so many had not been an unforeseen accident. It was a result of a system that had long been failing. The mine had been unsafe, the conditions deteriorating, and the negligence of the management had led to a catastrophe. In retrospect, the disaster seemed almost inevitable, a ticking time bomb that had finally gone off. The fact that it had taken so long for the truth to come to light seemed almost criminal. But even as the families fought for answers, the mine's owners, those who stood to profit from the workers' suffering, maintained their silence, as though they had little to lose in the face of such a tragedy. Yet, the more the families pressed for answers, the more they began to realize that this was not simply about the cause of the explosion. It was about the larger question of accountability. The collapse had taken away the lives of the miners, but it also revealed the deep cracks in the very foundation of Blackwell. The town had been built on exploitation, and that exploitation had, in the end, claimed its workers. The lunch pail, buried in the rubble, had become the metaphorical cornerstone for this new understanding. What had happened in Blackwell was not just an industrial accident. It was the outcome of years of systemic failure and human disregard. The families of the miners were no longer just fighting for justice for their loved ones. They were fighting for the right to be heard, for the right to demand better conditions, for the right to ensure that such a tragedy could never happen again. In the end, the lunch pail did more than just represent the loss of life. It became a powerful symbol of the truth, of the many lives that had been silenced by the mine owners and the system they upheld. It was a reminder that every life, no matter how humble, mattered. It was a testament to the resilience of those who had fought for a better future, and a reminder that the price of that fight had been far too high. The town of Blackwell had lived in the shadow of the mine for so long, but with the truth finally emerging, there was a sense of reckoning, a sense that the legacy of the miners' sacrifice might not be forgotten after all. The lunch pail, that simple, battered object, had forced the town to confront its past, and in doing so, it had allowed the voices of the men who had died in the mine be heard, finally. As the investigation into the collapse of Blackwell's mine unfolded, it became clear that the tragedy had been much more than an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger narrative, one that had been buried for decades beneath the weight of coal dust and corporate indifference. The families of the miners, who had long mourned in silence, were now calling for answers that had been long withheld, demanding the truth that had been buried alongside their loved ones. The lunch pail, still a haunting symbol of the past, continued to be at the center of their fight for justice. It was no longer just a reminder of one man's last meal, but a metaphor for the countless stories that had gone unheard, for the workers who had been exploited and forgotten, for the lives that had been reduced to mere statistics in the name of industrial progress. The more the town of Blackwell dug into the history of its mining operations, the more unsettling the truths became. In many ways, the collapse seemed almost inevitable. The warning signs had been there for years, perhaps even decades, but they had been ignored, buried under layers of complacency, fear, and, above all, greed. For so long, the mine had been the beating heart of Blackwell, the source of its livelihood, and the lifeblood of its community. The miners had lived and worked in its shadows, toiling in the dark for wages that barely kept their families afloat. But even as they struggled to make ends meet, they had been fully aware of the dangers that lurked beneath the earth. They lived with the constant hum of uncertainty, knowing that each day might be their last, and yet they had no choice but to return. The mine had become both a prison and a lifeline, trapping them in a system that valued their labor over their lives. The more the survivors and the families of the miners pressed for an investigation into the disaster, the more it became apparent that the cause of the explosion was not a singular event, but the culmination of years of mismanagement, neglect, and systemic failures. As the investigation into the mine's history revealed, the Blackwell Coal Company had been consistently cutting corners to maximize profits. Maintenance work had been neglected for years, safety protocols had been ignored, and the condition of the tunnels had deteriorated to dangerous levels. It was a chilling realization. The miners had been working in a mine that was actively falling apart, a mine that, at its core, had become a death trap. One of the most disturbing findings was the fact that the mine had been operating with outdated equipment, much of which had been in disrepair for years. The machinery that the miners relied on for their daily work had not been maintained properly, and in some cases, it had been patched together in hasty repairs. The safety equipment that was supposed to protect the workers was insufficient and often malfunctioned, leaving them vulnerable to the dangers that they faced underground every day. Worse still, the ventilation system that was supposed to keep the mine safe from the buildup of toxic gases, especially methane, had not been functioning properly for years. The gas, invisible and undetectable, had been accumulating in pockets within the mine, waiting for a spark, waiting for the moment when everything would ignite. The families of the miners, who had once accepted the tragedy as a part of life, now began to see the full extent of the injustice that had been done to their loved ones. They realized that the explosion had not been a freak accident, but the result of years of mismanagement and negligence. The Blackwell Coal Company had known about the dangers in the mine, but they had chosen to ignore them, prioritizing profit over the safety of their workers. The miners had been expendable, their lives secondary to the bottom line. It was a harsh truth, one that the families had not been willing to confront until now. But as more information came to light, it became clear that their loved ones had been betrayed, not just by the system that had been in place, but by the people who had run it. The lunch pail, now an object of immense emotional weight, was a constant reminder of the lives lost. It represented the quiet dignity of the men who had worked in the mines, men who had packed their lunches in the hope of returning home to their families at the end of the day, only to have their lives cut short by forces beyond their control. The half-eaten meal inside the pail, preserved by the very conditions that had destroyed the mine, had become a symbol of the men's final moments, an enduring testament to the lives of those who had been lost in the depths. It was impossible to ignore the question, what had these men been thinking in their final moments? Had they known that the end was coming, or had they been caught off guard, just as the explosion tore through the mine? These questions lingered unanswered, but the lunch pail seemed to suggest that the miners had been, in some way, conscious of the situation. They had paused, perhaps for just a moment, to eat their meal, to take a break from the unrelenting grind. And then, in an instant, everything had changed. In the months following the discovery of the lunch pail, the town of Blackwell became consumed with the investigation. The miners' families, driven by their need for closure, began to uncover more disturbing details. The mine's records, which had been kept under lock and key for years, were finally made available to the public. What they revealed was nothing short of a scandal. The mine's owners, who had for years maintained a facade of benevolence, had been complicit in the miners' suffering. The management had known about the structural problems in the mine, the inadequate safety measures, and the dangerous working conditions, but they had done nothing to address them. Instead, they had chosen to sweep the problems under the rug, ignoring the warnings from the workers and the experts who had raised concerns. They had placed their profits above human lives, and in doing so, they had condemned the miners to a fate they could not escape. The town of Blackwell had long been a place of quiet suffering, where the needs of the workers had been secondary to the demands of the mine. But the discovery of the lunch pail and the subsequent investigation into the cause of collapse changed everything. For the first time, the people of Blackwell were forced to confront the reality of their situation. The tragedy was no longer just a forgotten chapter in the town's history. It was a living, breathing testament to the injustices that had been committed. The lunch pail, once a forgotten object buried beneath the rubble, had become a symbol of the struggle for truth and accountability. As the investigation progressed, the families of the miners grew more determined to seek justice. They refused to let their loved ones be remembered only as victims of an industrial accident. They demanded that the mine's owners be held accountable for their role in the tragedy. The Blackwell Coal Company had profited from the labor of the miners, but when it came time to protect them, it had abandoned them. The owners, who had lived in distant comfort, had turned a blind eye to the dangers their workers faced every day. They had failed in their most basic responsibility, to ensure the safety of the people who worked for them. But even as the families pushed for accountability, the town itself was torn. There were some who believed that the Blackwell Coal Company had done what it could, that the collapse had been an unfortunate accident that could not have been avoided. These individuals, many of whom had worked in the mine themselves, felt that the miners had chosen to take on the risks, knowing full well the dangers they faced. In their view, the tragedy was simply part of the harsh reality of mining life. Others, however, saw things differently. They believed that the collapse was not just an accident but a preventable catastrophe, one that had been caused by years of corporate negligence and greed. The families of the miners were not asking for sympathy. They were asking for justice. They were asking for the truth to come to light, for the voices of their loved ones to be heard. The lunch pail, now a symbol of both loss and resilience, had become a focal point for this fight for justice. In a town where the past had been buried, where the workers had been forgotten, the pail had emerged as the last piece of the puzzle. It represented the final moments of the miners, a glimpse into their lives, and a symbol of everything they had lost. It had been left behind in the rubble, untouched by time, and now, in the search for answers, it had become a key to understanding what had truly happened in Blackwell's mine. For the families, the fight was personal. It was no longer just about the truth of the explosion. It was about honoring the lives of the miners, about ensuring that their sacrifice was not in vain. The lunch pail, with its small, half-eaten meal, had become a symbol of everything that had been denied to the miners. It was a symbol of the lives that had been stolen, of the workers who had been exploited and forgotten. And as the investigation continued, the people of Blackwell knew that they were no longer just uncovering the truth of one explosion. They were uncovering the truth of an entire town, a town that had been built on the backs of men who had been silenced for far too long. As the investigation into the Blackwell mine collapse continued to unfold, the town found itself divided. It was as if the tragedy had unbared not just the bones of the miners, but the deep fractures in the town's very soul. For years, Blackwell had been a place where the dangers of mining were accepted as part of the fabric of daily life. The collapse of the mine, which had seemed like an unavoidable accident to some, had revealed that those dangers were not simply the result of an inherent risk in the job, but of systemic negligence and human greed. The lunch pail, that simple object left behind in the mine, had become the focal point of an intense debate that rippled through the town. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about what Blackwell was willing to confront, what it was willing to admit about the systems that had upheld the mine for so long. It was about how far the people of Blackwell were willing to go to seek justice for those who had been lost, and whether they were ready to face the uncomfortable truths that had been buried beneath the earth for so many years. The families of the miners, once resigned to the tragedy, now found themselves at the center of a storm. They had spent years living with the knowledge that their loved ones had been taken too soon, but now they faced a deeper, more painful realization. They had been lied to. The Blackwell Coal Company had promised that the miners would be kept safe, that their welfare would be a priority, but the evidence being uncovered suggested otherwise. The miners had been sacrificed to a system that valued productivity over human life, a system that had grown complacent in its pursuit of profit, and the lunch pail was a symbol of this betrayal. It was a reminder of the lives that had been lost, yes, but it was also a reminder of the choices that had led to those deaths. Choices made by people who had never stepped foot in the mine, who had never experienced the harsh conditions that the workers faced every day. For the families, this new revelation was both a source of anger and a source of clarity. The past had been buried, hidden behind a veil of official reports and corporate rhetoric, but now the truth was coming to light. They could no longer accept the official story that the collapse had been a freak accident, a random tragedy that no one could have predicted. The more they learned, the more it became clear that the Blackwell Coal Company had known about the risks, had ignored warnings, and had failed to take the necessary precautions to prevent such a disaster. The lunch pail, with its untouched meal, had become a symbol of the miners' last moments, a final reminder that these men, like so many others, had been forced to work in a system that put their lives at risk every day. As the investigation revealed more details about the state of the mine, the stories of the survivors began to surface. These were men who had narrowly escaped the explosion, who had been lucky enough to be far enough from the blast when it occurred, but who still carried the scars, physical and emotional, of the event. Their stories painted a grim picture of the mine's conditions. They spoke of unstable tunnels, of equipment that was poorly maintained, and of the constant fear that they would be trapped beneath the earth. They spoke of the noise of the mine, the creaks and groans of the rock, the way the air felt thick with the promise of something bad happening. Yet, despite their fears, they continued to work. There was no choice. The wages were too vital, and the job market too scarce to consider anything else. The men who survived the explosion knew that they had been lucky, but the guilt they carried, guilt for living when so many others had died, was a heavy burden to bear. In the wake of the disaster, the town of Blackwell was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that the explosion had not been a random act of fate. It had been a result of years of negligence, of a mine that had been allowed to fall into disrepair, of a company that had placed profits over people. And yet, despite the mounting evidence of mismanagement, there was a resistance to fully acknowledge the truth. Many in Blackwell, particularly those who had been employed by the mine, continued to hold on to the belief that the collapse had been an unavoidable tragedy. They believed that the mine, despite its faults, had been a necessary part of the town's existence, and that it was a part of life that could not be easily discarded. For them, the Blackwell Coal Company had been the town's foundation, and the idea that it could be held accountable for the deaths of the miners felt like a betrayal of everything that the town had built. This division in the town's sentiment only deepened as more people began to question whether justice would ever be served. The families of the miners, for their part, continued to push for accountability. They had seen enough evidence to know that the mine's operators were responsible for the disaster, but the process of seeking justice was slow, mired in bureaucracy and legal obstacles. It seemed as though the very system that had allowed the mine to operate so recklessly was now standing in the way of any real resolution. The mine's owners had powerful allies, and those allies were doing everything they could to avoid responsibility. As time went on, it became clear that the fight for justice would not be easy, and that the families of the miners would have to confront not just the company that had caused the explosion, but the larger forces of power and corruption that had allowed the company to operate without consequence for so long.